In 1960s motorsports, a quiet rebellion was brewing in Midland, Texas. While the racing establishment looked forward to incremental improvements and evolutionary changes, a small group of engineers and drivers were about to rewrite the rules of the sport. They weren't content with following the well-worn paths laid down by decades of tradition. They asked a radical question. What if, instead of fighting against the air flowing over a race car, you could use it as a weapon? What if aerodynamics wasn't just something to minimize, but something to weaponize? The story of the Chaparral 2E is the story of how one man's obsession with engineering principles transformed racing forever, and how the sports establishment fought desperately to keep the innovation from taking over completely. By the mid-1960s, American road racing had found its groove. The cars were fast, the drivers were brave, and everyone knew roughly what they were building. The formula was simple. Take a mid-engine chassis, bolt in a powerful V8, add some suspension geometry, and you had yourself a competitive racing machine. It worked. Year after year, teams refined this basic architecture. But for a man like Jim Hall, refinement wasn't enough. Hall was an engineer first and a racer second, a dangerous combination when paired with curiosity and access to resources. In 1962, with his partner Hap Sharp, a skilled driver and businessman, Hall founded Chaparral Cars in Midland, Texas. The company would become the single most innovative racing operation of the 1960s. The Chaparral 2, unveiled in 1963, didn't look revolutionary at first glance. It was a mid-engined sports car with a fiberglass chassis, a semi-monocoque design inspired by aerospace engineering principles. But Hall was already thinking ahead. Within the first season of racing, he began experimenting with aerodynamic devices. The problem was simple. At high speeds, his otherwise brilliant car was becoming unstable. The front end wanted to lift, so Hall's solution was equally simple: create aerodynamic forces to push the front end down. He added small wings to the front of the car, inverted airplane wings that generated downforce instead of lift. This wasn't entirely new. A young Swiss engineer named Michael May had tried the same thing a decade earlier on a Porsche 550 Spider in 1956. But that experiment had been shut down by Porsche officials who feared the implications. Hall's approach was different. He didn't see aerodynamics as an oddball experiment. He saw it as a fundamental principle of physics that could be applied systematically to every aspect of racing. By 1964 and 1965, Hall's Chaparral 2s and the improved 2C variants were nearly unbeatable in the SCCA's United States Road Racing Championship. The cars won 11 of 16 races in 1964 and dominated again in 1965. Their success wasn't just due to aerodynamics. Hall was pioneering tire technology with Firestone, developing innovative suspension designs, and pushing the boundaries of transmission engineering. In fact, perhaps the most underrated innovation was the adoption of a semi-automatic transmission derived from Chevrolet's Powerglide. This wasn't a conventional automatic transmission retrofitted into a race car. This was a purpose-built racing transmission, a 2-speed torque converter unit that allowed for incredibly smooth power delivery and eliminated the shock loads associated with manual gear changes. Most importantly, it freed up the driver's left foot. In a car with a conventional clutch pedal, that foot was occupied during gear changes. In Hall's Chaparral, the left foot could do something else entirely. What that something else would be became the 2E's defining feature. While the Chaparral 2 and 2C were cleaning up in American road racing, Hall was already planning his masterpiece. The 1966 season would bring the debut of the Canadian-American Challenge Cup, or Can-Am, a new series designed for the fastest, most advanced sports cars in the world. For Can-Am's inaugural season, Hall decided to build a car that would embody everything he'd learned about aerodynamics, engineering, and racing. The result was the Chaparral 2E, and it was unlike anything the motorsports world had ever seen. The 2E was a stunning machine to behold, though not in a conventionally beautiful way. Its radiators were relocated from the traditional position in the front to 2 ducted pods mounted alongside the cockpit. This freed up space in the nose for something far more important: an air duct that would channel air upward and over the front end, creating aerodynamic downforce on the front wheels. But the most striking feature was what sat 4 feet 6 inches above the rear deck of the car, a massive wing mounted on tall struts that rose dramatically above the bodywork. This was the heart of Hall's aerodynamic philosophy, and it worked on principles that would become fundamental to racing for decades to come. The wing itself was engineered with precision. At a base angle of 17 to 18 degrees of negative incidence, angled downward to generate downforce, it would produce approximately 240 pounds of downforce at 100 miles per hour. But this wing had something no racing wing had possessed before. It was adjustable. The struts that held the wing weren't merely structural supports. They were precision-engineered components that contained hydraulic systems, allowing the driver to change the angle of the wing while the car was moving. Moreover, and this was crucial, the wing's forces were fed directly into the rear suspension uprights. Instead of mounting the wing to the chassis, loading the entire car's body with aerodynamic forces, Hall had mounted it directly to the wheels through the suspension. This was a breakthrough. The forces pushing the car down through aerodynamic effects went directly to the tires, which was where they mattered most for traction and handling. To operate this system, Hall had incorporated a floor pedal positioned exactly where a clutch pedal would sit in a conventional race car. But the 2E had no clutch. It used a 3-speed version of the Chevrolet automatic transmission. When the driver pressed this left pedal, it would flatten out the rear wing, reducing its angle of attack and therefore reducing downforce and drag. Simultaneously, the pedal would also close an air flap in the front nose duct, reducing front-end downforce as well. The engineering was fail-safe and automatic. If the driver held the pedal down, the car would maintain its downforce-reduced configuration. When released, the wing and front duct would return to full downforce position. The effect was electrifying from an engineering standpoint, but it also presented a peculiar problem. The driver had to brake with the left foot in order to keep the right foot available for throttle control. This meant left foot braking became an absolute necessity in the 2E, a technique that would have sounded utterly insane just a few years earlier, but was now the only way to operate this machine properly. Before we go further into the 2E's story, we need to understand that the concept of aerodynamic wings on racing cars wasn't entirely new. A decade earlier, in 1956, a young Swiss engineer named Michael May had mounted an inverted aircraft wing on his Porsche 550 Spyder. May was only 22 years old and was studying engineering when he became fascinated with the concept of using aerodynamic forces to improve a car's grip. He and his brother Pierre designed and built a wing with an NACA airfoil profile, engineered to generate downforce. They even devised a clever linkage system that allowed the wing to be adjusted via a lever in the cockpit. When they brought this machine to the 1956 1,000 kilometers of the Nürburgring, the paddock erupted in a mixture of laughter and concern. Here was this ungainly-looking apparatus, this thing that looked more like a barn door than a racing car component, and yet, in practice, it lapped the circuit 4 seconds faster than the factory Porsche 550A entries. But success bred jealousy, and jealousy bred protests. Porsche's Motorsport director, Huschke von Honstein, objected vehemently. He invoked fears about safety, about the structural failures of air brakes on the 300 SL, about what might happen if this contraption came loose at speed. The officials, caught between innovation and caution, sided with tradition. They ruled that the wing obstructed the view of trailing competitors and ordered it removed. Michael May's revolutionary idea was buried before it could even properly take off. The concept of aerodynamic downforce would remain dormant for a decade, waiting for someone with the resources and determination to resurrect it. That someone was Jim Hall. When the Can-Am series began in September 1966 at Circuit Mont-Tremblant in Canada, the Chaparral 2E was supposed to be there. But it wasn't. Hall and the Chaparral team, working frantically to perfect the system, weren't ready for the first race. Instead, they missed that opening round, arriving for the second round at Bridgehampton Race Circuit in New York. The press, expecting revolutionary aerodynamics, was initially disappointed. But what they saw when the 2E finally took to the track was enough to make everyone forget about the missed opening round. The car was visibly different from anything else in the series. It was fast, extraordinarily fast. At Bridgehampton, Phil Hill, the legendary American driver who had also co-founded and driven for Ferrari's American operations, took the wheel of one of the two ES. He qualified superbly and ran competitively throughout the race, ultimately finishing fourth. Jim Hall, the designer and owner, drove the other two E and had to retire. The early races revealed a pattern. The Chaparral was extraordinarily fast. Fastest in qualifying, fastest in practice, commanding at points through the race. But reliability remained elusive. The team was pushing the boundaries of what was possible, and sometimes those boundaries broke. The innovative systems that gave the 2E its advantages were also unproven and temperamental. The third round came at Motorsport Park in Canada, where Hall and Hill's 2E again demonstrated raw speed. But again, mechanical gremlins intervened. Hall drove a solid race before retiring, and Hill had to settle for a distant second place. However, something remarkable was happening. While the Lolas and McLarens of the Can-Am field were winning races, everyone who mattered knew that the Chaparral wasn't being beaten because it lacked speed. It was being beaten by its own ambition. The car was fighting against the very laws of physics that Hall was trying to harness. Then came Laguna Seca in October. The narrow, twisting California circuit, with its dramatic elevation changes, would be the proving ground for Hall's theories. And at Laguna Seca, everything came together perfectly. The team had refined the systems, solved the most pressing reliability issues, and fitted longer wings with end plates. Phil Hill and Jim Hall came to dominate the race. In the first heat, they finished first and second, with Hill taking the victory. In the second heat, they repeated the feat, with Hall winning this time and Hill second. When the points were combined, Hill emerged with the overall victory. For one shining moment, the Chaparral 2E, the radical experiment, the outlaw machine that shouldn't have worked, proved itself to be the fastest car in the series. But dominance in one race couldn't overcome a season's worth of mechanical failures and missed opportunities. The 2E finished the Can-Am season with Phil Hill and Jim Hall in fourth and fifth positions respectively. The cars had been fast enough to lead or compete in virtually every race. They had posted the fastest lap times with startling regularity, yet they had won only one race. The series was won by John Surtees in his Lola T70, a more conventional machine that was fast enough and, more importantly, reliable enough. By conventional measures, the Chaparral 2E had failed. By any other measure, it had revolutionized motorsports. What made the 2E's story so compelling was the teamwork that drove it. Phil Hill was 39 years old in 1966, a veteran driver with countless victories and a Formula One World Championship to his name. He had driven for Ferrari, Porsche, Cooper, and many others. He came to Chaparral to be part of something special, to drive a machine that was genuinely pushing the sport forward. And he did, bringing not just his legendary skills, but also his engineering acumen. Hill understood the physics of what Hall was trying to accomplish and could provide feedback that helped refine the systems. Jim Hall himself was also a driver, though by 1966 his focus was primarily on engineering and ownership. At Laguna Seca, Hall demonstrated that he could still drive at the highest level, posting the fastest qualifying lap before retiring from the race while running in a competitive position. Together, Hill and Hall represented something rare in motorsports, a true partnership between a legendary driver and a brilliant engineer, each bringing their expertise to bear on the same problem. The reliability struggles of the 2E weren't signs of a flawed concept. They were signs of the system being pushed beyond what conventional engineering could handle. The tall struts carrying the wing experienced enormous cyclical loads under acceleration and over bumps. The hydraulic systems that actuated the adjustable wing surfaces were cutting-edge but still somewhat temperamental. The semi-automatic transmission, while brilliant in its design, was operating in an environment it had never been designed to handle, at speeds and loads that pushed its limits. Every component of the 2E was operating at the edge of what was possible, and sometimes that edge proved too sharp. But while the 1966 season ended without a championship, it accomplished something far more significant. It changed racing forever. The concept of the high-mounted, adjustable aerodynamic wing had been proven. The principle that aerodynamic forces could be fed directly into the suspension for maximum effect had been demonstrated. The idea that a driver could actively manage aerodynamic balance through a pedal control had been validated. And perhaps most importantly, the notion that a small team with brilliant engineers could outrun the big factory efforts through innovation had been established. The sport would never be the same. By 1968, wings had appeared on Formula One cars. The Lotus 49B of Graham Hill, driven to victory at Monaco, featured modest front and rear wings. Other teams quickly followed. What Hall had pioneered at Chaparral became standard across every racing series. What had seemed outlandish, what had been derided as unnecessary complication, had become the future of racing. Within just 2 years, aerodynamic wings were mandatory equipment, and engineers around the world were racing to develop ever more sophisticated aerodynamic systems. The revolutionary had become conventional with shocking speed. But Hall's innovations didn't stop at the 2E. In 1970, he unveiled the Chaparral 2J, and it would prove to be both the ultimate expression of Hall's aerodynamic philosophy and simultaneously the catalyst for its own destruction. The 2J was a car that looked like something from an alien world. Its underbody was nearly completely sealed with adjustable Lexan plastic skirts that could move up and down to maintain ground clearance while creating a sealed chamber underneath the car. From the rear of that chamber protruded 2 large fans, adapted from military tank engines and powered by a single 2-stroke twin-cylinder engine. These fans would literally suck air from beneath the car, creating a vacuum that pulled the machine onto the track with incredible force. The downforce numbers were staggering. When fully loaded with fuel, oil, and coolant, the 2J could generate between 1.25 and 1.5 G of downforce. For context, conventional aerodynamic devices at that time generated perhaps 0.8 G at best. The 2J could corner and brake at speeds and forces that would have been completely impossible for any other car. It was faster by seconds per lap than the next fastest machine. It wasn't just faster, it was operating in a different performance envelope entirely. And then it was banned. The FIA, the international sanctioning body for motorsports, succumbed to pressure from rival teams who argued that the suction fans constituted movable aerodynamic devices and therefore violated the regulations. There were also concerns about track debris being sucked into the fans and then ejected at dangerous velocities toward trailing competitors. Teams like McLaren, which had dominated Can-Am for years, were genuinely frightened of what the 2J meant for their future competitiveness. In their panic, they lobbied the FIA and the SCCA to take action. Despite having been initially approved, the 2J was eventually prohibited. Jim Hall's response to the ban was pragmatic. He acknowledged that he and his engineers hadn't fully anticipated all the implications of their design. The massive cyclical loads from the wheel bumps on the tall wing struts had been underestimated. The ground effect principle, while incredibly powerful, created effects that nobody fully understood. And the fan-powered suction system, while undeniably effective, had generated concerns about fairness and safety that the sport's governing bodies couldn't ignore. But more than that, Hall accepted that sometimes innovation moves faster than the sport can accommodate. The 2J had proven ground effect worked. The principle would return later, perfected and refined, in Colin Chapman's Lotus 78 and 79 of the mid to late 1970s. These cars, which used carefully sculpted underbody shapes to generate ground effect, became legal and utterly dominant, changing Formula One forever. The legacy of Chaparral cars and Jim Hall extended far beyond the 1960s. Hall went on to build Indy cars using ground effect principles that won races, and in at least 2 instances, the Indianapolis 500 itself. He pioneered data acquisition systems that allowed engineers to monitor exactly what was happening to a car during a race, gathering information that would be used to refine and improve systems. He developed testing facilities at his private Rattlesnake Raceway in Texas, where tire companies and engineers could experiment with new compounds and designs. Most of all, he established the principle that engineering innovation, pursued with rigor and creativity, could overcome the established order in racing. The story of the Chaparral 2E is ultimately a story about progress and resistance to progress. In the early 1960s, racing was in danger of becoming stagnant. The basic formulas had been established, refined, and perfected. Everyone knew what worked, and everyone knew that experimenting with unproven ideas was risky and probably foolish. But Hall and his small team said no to that comfortable consensus. They asked impertinent questions. They spent money and resources on ideas that might fail. They pushed against the boundaries of what was considered safe and sensible. And in doing so, they fundamentally transformed the sport. The aerodynamic wing, which seems so obvious and natural now, was once considered a dangerous aberration. The idea of managing aerodynamics actively through adjustable systems was thought to be unnecessarily complicated. Ground effect, which would dominate racing for decades, was thought to be a parlor trick that violated the spirit of fair competition. And yet, all of these ideas, born from Jim Hall's systematic approach to applying engineering principles to racing, became the foundation of modern motorsport design. The Chaparral 2E didn't win the Can-Am championship, but it won something far more important. It won the argument about the future of racing. Today, every racing series is defined by its aerodynamic regulations. Formula One engineers spend countless hours optimizing wing designs and diffuser shapes. IndyCar teams obsess over downforce levels and drag coefficients. Even stock car racing in NASCAR has become largely about aerodynamic efficiency and balance. The debate that once raged about whether aerodynamic complexity was worth the risk has been settled decisively. The Chaparral 2E was the first domino to fall in that victory for innovation.